Chapter 5. What did Paul say? The Apostle Paul teaches on the subject of divorce and remarriage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and Romans chapter 7, which I will explore in much greater depth in later chapters. In this chapter, however, I want to review the basic statements that Paul makes, discuss them very briefly, and add what we can be relatively sure that he taught to our graph from the last chapter. It's my hope that by comparing the teachings of Jesus and Paul in this way, it will help us understand the Bible's holistic teaching on divorce and remarriage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. Quote, "But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife." End quote. Not I, but the Lord. This is a very important point. Paul tells us what he believes Jesus taught about divorce and remarriage. I will argue in this chapter that this verse shows that Paul essentially summarized the different gospel accounts of Jesus' teaching on divorce and remarriage and came to the same conclusion as the traditional view, that divorce is acceptable in the case of fornication, but remarriage is always forbidden while the other spouse lives. Paul's perfect summary. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. Remarriage after divorce is adultery. Yes. Marrying a divorcee is adultery. Yes. Divorcing improperly equals guilt of adultery. Implied. Sexes reversed. Yes. Exceptions for divorce. Yes. If my graph above is correct, then Paul seems to have nearly perfectly summarized all the teaching of Jesus on divorce and remarriage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. In this chapter, I want to go through each point on the graph and explain my reasoning for each choice, to make this point very clear. It will also be good foundational information for the rest of the book. Remarriage after divorce is adultery. Adding yes to this box was easy to justify because it says, quote, "But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband." End quote. This is essentially forbidding remarriage because the woman's only two options after divorce are remaining unmarried or reconciling with her spouse. Paul does not explicitly use the word adultery here, as he is not directly addressing the consequences of disobedience, but rather what he expects Christians to do in the case of divorce. It's evident that Paul is essentially forbidding remarriage here based on the Lord's teaching that remarriage while the original spouse is still alive constitutes adultery, Luke chapter 16 verse 18 and Mark chapter 10 verses 11 and 12. Marrying a divorcee is adultery. While this is not directly stated in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 10 and 11, it's taken for granted when it says that the only two options for a divorced person are to remain unmarried or be reconciled with the original spouse. For example, if a Christian man who has not yet been married wanted to marry a woman who had been divorced before, he could know that it was forbidden for him to marry someone who had been divorced based on 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 10 and 11 alone. This is because he could see that the only options for the woman in this passage who had been divorced before is to remain unmarried or be reconciled to her original husband. Therefore, for him to marry a woman in a similar situation would cause both he and her to be disobeying this teaching from the Lord. Of course, Paul was simply basing this teaching on Luke chapter 16 verse 18 and Mark chapter 10 verses 11 and 12. Which clearly teaches that marrying a divorced person was adultery. Exception for divorce. The idea that there was an acceptable reason for divorce is clear from Paul saying, quote, "if she does leave," end quote. Clearly, Paul thinks that Jesus taught that there was an exception for divorce. We know that this is speaking of divorce and not just separation, because Paul then says that if she does leave, quote, "she must remain unmarried," end quote. In other words, she is no longer married in that scenario. There was a divorce that caused her to be referred to as unmarried. It seems without question that Paul considered the exception clauses in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 and chapter 19 verse 9 to be exceptions for divorce, because the woman who left in this example is still in a right relationship with God, as long as she remains unmarried or is reconciled to her original husband. Divorcing improperly equals guilty of adultery. I will admit that I am stretching it a bit by saying that this passage is also teaching that divorcing improperly, for a reason other than fornication, makes one guilty of adultery, which is why I only said that it was implied on the above chart. However, I would say that such a teaching is the logical conclusion of the passage, and it can be reasonably demonstrated by combining the following ideas. Paul, who says that this teaching is from the Lord, allows for divorce, quote, if she does leave, end quote, which can only be a reference to the exception clauses in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 and chapter 19 verse 9, where Jesus allows for divorce in the event of fornication. Paul also says that in the case where one, quote, does leave, end quote, they are to remain unmarried or be reconciled, implying that if she disobeyed and got remarried anyway, she would be guilty of the very adultery Jesus warned of in Luke chapter 16, verse 18, and Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. Therefore, Matthew chapter 5, verse 32 is implied in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. And remember what Matthew chapter 5, verse 32 says, quote, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, end quote. Sexes reversed. Paul also seems to have picked up on the Lord's teaching in Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, in which he gave an example of a woman initiating a divorce. And Paul also included both scenarios in this passage, a woman leaving her husband and a man leaving his wife. Quote, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. End quote. Even though in the Roman culture women could initiate a divorce, in the Jewish culture it was much more common that men were the ones who initiated divorces. This passage, along with Jesus' teaching in Mark chapter 10, made sure that the followers of Jesus would know that a woman had the right to divorce or separate from her husband, even though remarriage would not be an option for either in that case. Paul's conclusion, till death do us part. Paul concludes this lengthy chapter by bringing up another aspect of the divorce and remarriage debate that is incredibly important, which is that the marriage bond is only broken by death. Quote, a wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. End quote. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39. Paul says that remarriage was only possible after the other spouse had died. Paul makes a similar statement in Romans chapter 7. Quote, for the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning the husband. So then, if while her husband is living she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man. End quote. Romans chapter 7, verse 2 and 3. Why does Paul believe that death makes remarriage possible? A fair question would be, why is Paul so emphatic that death of the other spouse is the deciding factor as to whether you could get remarried after a divorce? He seems to talk about it like it is something everyone knows. I will argue in the next chapter that everyone who read Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 4 in the Old Testament should have known this, but we don't have to go back that far to understand Paul's argument. All we need to do is look at what Jesus said to the Pharisees when they tested him about divorce in Matthew chapter 19. Quote, and he answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, Let no man separate." End quote. Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. The idea that God supernaturally joins a man and a woman in marriage into one flesh is a key to understanding why, even though divorce may be possible in certain circumstances, remarriage is always adultery while the other lives. This is because if God doesn't undo the one flesh bond of a man and a woman, even after divorce, then the only way for one person to be remarried without adultery is if the other half of that one flesh bond is no longer living. If you understand this one concept, that God does not revoke the one flesh bond that He supernaturally created in the first marriage for any reason other than death, then you will understand the logic of Jesus and Paul regarding divorce and remarriage. Conclusion. In conclusion, Paul's teachings on divorce and remarriage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and Romans chapter 7 provide a crucial perspective that reinforces the words of Jesus. By summarizing Jesus' teachings, Paul consistently upholds the sanctity of marriage, emphasizing that divorce may be allowed under specific circumstances, but remarriage is only possible after the death of a spouse.